The year is 1957. The Cold War has reached a terrifying fever pitch. Both Washington and Moscow are no longer just planning for war. They are planning for the end of the world. The military strategists of the Soviet Union knew that the next great war wouldn't be fought on green fields. It would be fought on an irradiated, scorched wasteland, moments after the hydrogen bombs had finished falling. They needed a machine that could drive directly into the epicenter of a nuclear blast and keep fighting. A machine that was immune to radiation, unflippable by shockwaves, and terrifying to behold. The greatest tank designers in the USSR were given an impossible task: build the ultimate heavy tank for the nuclear apocalypse. The result was something that looked like it didn't belong on Earth. It didn't look like a tank. It looked like a grounded UFO. This is the story of Object 279, the 60-ton radioactive beast designed to survive doomsday. It remains, to this day, the strangest, most ambitious, and most terrifying battle tank ever constructed. To understand Object 279, you have to understand the threat it was facing. A nuclear explosion creates a shock wave of pressure, moving faster than the speed of sound. It hits with enough force to flip a 50-ton T-54 tank upside down like a toy car. The lead designer, the legendary L.S. Troyanov, realized that a traditional boxy tank shape was a death sentence. The tank needed to be aerodynamic, not for speed, but to let the nuclear blast wave flow around it. The result was a cast hull shaped like a flattened ellipsoid, a flying saucer on tracks. There were no flat surfaces, no corners for the blast wave to catch onto. It was a masterpiece of defensive geometry, but the shape wasn't just about aerodynamics. It was about armor. The saucer was actually a thin, disposable anti-heat shield. Underneath it lay the true monster. The main armor cast was incredibly complex and massive. The frontal armor reached an effective thickness of nearly 300 millimeters, and the turret front was a staggering 320 millimeters of curved steel. In 1957, there was not a single tank gun in the NATO arsenal, not the British Conqueror, not the American M103, that could penetrate Object 279 from the front. It was, for all practical purposes, invincible on the battlefield of its day. But surviving the blast was only half the problem. The tank still had to move across a landscape turned into radioactive mud. And for that, Troyanov did something completely insane. If the saucer-shaped hull made Object 279 look like a UFO, its undercarriage made it look like a nightmare from a science fiction novel. Look closely at the tracks. Most tanks have 2. Object 279 has 4. Why? Because a nuclear war doesn't just create heat and radiation. It destroys the very geography of the Earth. It turns cities into rubble, forests into tangled log jams, and fields into radioactive swamps. A standard tank would get bellied, stuck on its own underside, trying to navigate the chaos of a post-nuclear landscape. By spreading 60 tons of weight over 4 tracks, the ground pressure of Object 279 was incredibly low, only 0.6 kilograms per square centimeter. That is less than the pressure of a human foot. This meant the tank could drive through deep snow, soft sand, and thick marshland, where any other vehicle would simply sink and die. The tracks were mounted on 2 longitudinal hollow beams, which also served as fuel tanks. This was a brilliant, albeit dangerous, use of space. But there was a hidden price for this mobility. Maintenance was a nightmare. If an inner track broke or a wheel jammed, the crew had to practically dismantle the entire suspension to reach it. In a war zone, this was a critical flaw. But the Soviet High Command didn't care about maintenance. They cared about the breakthrough. A tank that can survive a nuclear blast is useless if it can't strike back with the fury of a god. For Object 279, the Soviets chose the 130mm M65 rifled gun. This wasn't just a tank gun. This was a naval-grade monster adapted for the land. It fired massive shells with a muzzle velocity of 1,000 meters per second. From 2 miles away, it could punch through the armor of any Western tank with terrifying ease. To handle this power, the tank featured a semi-automatic loading system, giving it a rate of fire of 5 to 7 rounds per minute. It was equipped with a stereoscopic rangefinder and a 2-plane stabilizer. In 1957, this was Star Wars technology. But the most advanced feature for the time was the infrared night vision. The tank had a massive IR searchlight mounted next to the gun, allowing the commander to hunt Allied tanks in total darkness, while the enemy was left blind. Inside the tank, the 4-man crew lived in a pressurized, lead-lined citadel. This was the world's most advanced NBC, nuclear, biological, chemical protection system. While the outside of the tank was covered in radioactive dust and lethal isotopes, the air inside was scrubbed by massive filters. The crew breathed pure oxygen, isolated from the poisoned world outside. To power this 60-ton fortress, the Soviets installed a 1,000-horsepower diesel engine. It allowed the tank to reach speeds of 55 kilometers per hour. Imagine this saucer-shaped beast screaming across a radioactive plain at highway speeds, shrugging off shells and blast waves alike. It was the ultimate weapon for a war that seemed inevitable. So, why did it never see combat? Why is there only one left in the world? Object 279 was a masterpiece. It was faster, better armored, and more mobile than almost anything on the planet. By 1959, it had passed all its trials with flying colors. It was ready for mass production. It was ready to lead the Soviet armored fist across the radioactive plains of Europe. But the monster met an enemy it couldn't defeat. Politics. Narrator. In 1960, a high-level demonstration was held for the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev was a man obsessed with a new kind of power: missiles. He looked at the massive, expensive 60-ton Object 279 and saw a relic of a bygone era. Khrushchev famously declared that heavy tanks are obsolete. He believed that guided missiles would make armor useless. On his orders, a decree was passed. No more tanks over 37 tons would be built. With a single stroke of a pen, the fate of Object 279 was sealed. The project was halted. The assembly lines that were being prepared were dismantled. The engineers, who had spent years perfecting the saucer hull and the 4-track system, were told to move on to smaller, lighter designs. The UFO tank was dead before it ever had the chance to fire a shot in anger. For decades, Object 279 existed only as a rumor in the West, a shadow tank seen in grainy, leaked photos. Only 2 or 3 prototypes were ever built. Most were scrapped for their valuable steel, but one survived. Today, Tucked away in the shadows of the Kubinka Tank Museum near Moscow, the last Object 279 stands as a silent sentinel. It sits among hundreds of other steel monsters, but it still draws the most attention. Even in a room full of titans, it looks like it came from another planet. Visitors from all over the world come to see its strange 4-track suspension and its massive 130-millimeter gun. To touch its cold hull is to touch a different version of history, a path the world almost took. It is a physical reminder of a time when we weren't just afraid of nuclear war. We were building the tools to live through it. Though it never saw a real battlefield, Object 279 has found a second life in the digital world. In games like War Thunder and World of Tanks, it has become one of the most sought-after and feared vehicles. New generations of players who weren't even alive during the Cold War now know the terror of facing the nuclear UFO. It has become a symbol of Soviet brutalism, a design philosophy where form followed a very dark function. It represents the pinnacle of the heavy tank era, a final, beautiful, and terrifying gasp of steam and steel before the age of digital warfare began. Looking back at Object 279, we have to ask ourselves, was it a brilliant solution to an impossible problem, or was it the ultimate symbol of human hubris? We built a tank to survive the end of the world, forgetting that if the world ends, there is nowhere left for the tank to go. It remains a masterpiece of a war that never happened, a machine built for the day the sun touched the earth. What do you think? If NATO had seen this monster on the border, would it have changed the course of history? Let us know in the comments. And stay tuned for our next episode, where we go from the ground to the sky once again. We will explore the Tu-119, the Soviet Union's attempt to build a long-range bomber powered by a live nuclear reactor in the wings. You think the UFO tank was crazy? Wait until you see the flying reactor. Subscribe now.